Hey everybody, Emily here. It's time for Lesson 3 of Witchcraft Fundamentals, Sacred Space and Divination. You've probably heard people talking about magic circles. It's a rabbit hole. You see them on television, you see them in movies, movies like The Craft, art, like William Waterhouse has a wonderful painting called The Magic Circle. You see a woman on the beach with a big sword and a big circle around a big cauldron. Seems very magical and special. Well, let me tell you, magic doesn't have to be done in a perfectly cut, physical 9-foot diameter circle. However, it can be helpful to do magic in sacred space. And we're going to talk all about how that works, and then we're going to talk about divination, another one of the practitioner's most fundamental tools. So, what is sacred space? People will disagree, but when I'm using the term sacred space, I mean specific physical space that has been set in such a way that it is specifically for magical and or devotional use. So, your kitchen counter at different times might be sacred space. If you are preparing a beautiful, loving meal for your family, filling it with magical intention, you might create sacred space to create that meal. And then you take down that space and it just becomes your kitchen counter where you make lunch. It can be a lot of things. Some sacred space is permanent. Think of churches, temples, shrines, sacred areas that are set aside permanently for, special use. Other sacred space is temporary. The kitchen counter example. Things like temporary altars, temporary working spaces, things you're doing on the go, and the ubiquitous magic circle. They're not usually permanent. You put them up, you bring them down. We'll talk about it in a minute. So, there are 3 reasons to cast sacred space. And it's basically protection, energetic containment, and consecration. Those are your 3 most common reasons to create sacred space. So protection. When you do magic, magical things notice. Every time you change the energy around you, you are creating little ripple effects. And other things that are aware of those energies might notice. If somebody has a lighthouse shining in the darkness, you're off a ways, you're going to see it. Magic is not as common as it once was. Depending on where you live, there might be very low kind of vital energy. So you're doing magic might be a huge set of fireworks going off and everything's going to notice. Maybe you live in a place where the energy is strong, it flows all the time, and you're just going to be a tiny little ripple. Nothing will pay much attention. But you don't really know until you start doing your work. For that reason, you might cast a protective circle, so that while you're doing your magic, it doesn't send big old fireworks into the sky signaling it's time for an open buffet. Keeps things secure, lowers the risk, particularly if you're not confident in what you're doing. Energetic containment. A lot of magical ritual and a lot of spell work involves raising energies. When you raise energy, it needs to go somewhere. Shocking, I know. So you might cast a magical circle or other type of sacred space so that you can fill that space with that energy and it will remain contained. It's not going to just dissipate out into the ether. When you try to gather water, you put it in a bowl. When you try to gather energy, you need some way to contain it. As you get more adept, having that extra help and containment is not always necessary. But as a beginner, it makes your life so much easier. I really do recommend it. Then there's consecration. And consecration is really cleansing an area of mundane energies so that it can be tuned for sacred use. If you are, say you're going to do spell work in your living room, and half an hour ago you were watching a football game and chatting at the television, there's going to be some leftover energy from that in the room. And so you want to make sure that before you start a magical working, well, you need a clean workspace. So you need to cleanse and consecrate the area for your intention, so you don't have residual shouting at the television energy messing with your spell work. Not the most effective way to do magic. So those are the main reasons you will use sacred space. And we'll talk specifically about how to create sacred space in a little bit. So the first step in thinking about sacred space is to think about the physical location where you're going to be doing your magic. Think about where you live, where you work, where you spend your time. Where are the places you're going to be doing magic? And what are the energies of those spaces? I live in the suburbs. I have a yard. I have some space between me and my neighbors, and I'm able to tune the energy of my property to be a particular flavor of energy. When I used to live in an apartment, I had a much smaller energetic footprint. It was not kosher for me to cleanse and concentrate my entire apartment building, nor would it have been effective, because I can't control what my neighbors do, and why would I? Smaller footprint. Stick to the area you can actually control. But it also had a very different flavor. If you live in a big building with lots and lots of people, there's all kinds of energy happening all the time. If you are in a single family home with some property, it's usually a much quieter, calmer kind of energy, unless you have toddlers or maybe a pack of dogs. Not judging. There's all kinds of things out there. The difference between being in a city versus being in a rural area versus being out in the wilderness, the energy of the spaces is very, very different. And the history of those spaces are very, very different. Depending on where you live, if you're here in the United States, you're probably on colonized land. There's actually many, many places in the world where chances are real good you're sitting on colonized land. A lot of Latin America, a lot of Africa, big chunks of Southeast Asia. So we like to make sure you know the history of the land you live on. Out here in the suburbs north of Seattle, this land was indigenous, Coast Salish land before European settlement came. The first European settlers were chicken farmers. And then, it became a suburban development in the mid-20th century. There's actually not a lot of layers of human history on this particular land. So when I try to do things, there's not a lot of barriers to any kind of energy work I want to do. Now, I have a good friend that lives in Pioneer Square. Pioneer Square in Seattle is one of the oldest neighborhoods in this area, period. One of the oldest, established neighborhoods in the state, really. And when she does magic, she has several hundred years of European history and many more of Native American culture who also lived in that area to contend with. There are spirits, there are entities, there are energies that have particular thoughts and opinions about what happens in their territory. So you have to think about where you live. If you're in an ethnic neighborhood, there are certain cultural beliefs about magic and spirits that might affect your spell work. If you live in an area that is very monotheistically religious, the ambient energy of your neighbors is something you might have to protect yourself against in order to have a clean slate to do productive magical workings. You have to know where you are and what the energies around you are like. If you are someone who lives in colonized land, many of the local tribes might have something like a land acknowledgement that they ask people to say before they do workings, or to basically acknowledge the history of where you are. Here in the Puget Sound, many of our local tribes have land acknowledgement statements on their websites. And the land acknowledgement that I use before I do any major magical working is, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the first peoples of the Puget Sound region, the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the traditional stewards of the land. Pretty simple. It is very much the absolute least you can do to respect the history of the land you're on if you are on colonized land. I encourage you, if you are on colonized land, to look up the websites of your local tribes and see if they have specific land acknowledgements they would prefer people to use. I will say a land acknowledgement before I do a ritual, before I do major spell work, and I also say it before I go into the wilderness that is usually ancestral indigenous land, like before I go hiking or camping or that sort of thing. And it's just an energetic statement of gratitude and acknowledgement of what has come before. It's a little tiny bit of making peace in a very troubling piece of history that we're all still trying to figure out what to do with. So, simple thing you can do to help harmonize your energies with the space you live, or the space where you're doing your workings. Once you've taken the time to research the history of your land, maybe do a little bit more work to connect with it, see where you are, you can think about devotional space versus working space. Now, devotional space is a lot of what most people think of as sacred space. It's temples, altars, shrines, places where you are being energetically devoted to some type of spiritual, often entity, often deity. You might have an ancestor shrine, shrines to nature spirits, that sort of thing. It's places where you are going to commune with things that are greater than yourself. Devotions are not necessarily intrinsic to witchcraft, but for many, many practitioners, most that I know, they will incorporate their spirituality with their magical practice. So you may choose or may not to have devotional sacred space as something that is adjacent to your magical work. That's why I bring it up. That can be a lot of different things. Like I said, many people have special shelves where they have the pictures of those who have passed. Sometimes there'll be a candle, maybe a memento, things like that. Ancestor altars, essentially. Those are very, very common, and they're wonderful pieces of devotional space that can actually segue into magical ancestor work and other things, which we'll talk about in a few months when we talk about metaphysical entities. A thing to remember about altars is an altar does not have to be big, permanent thing with statues. An altar can be your computer desktop background, your phone lock screen, a shoebox diorama. It can be the inside of a locket. An altar is any space specifically devoted to an energetic purpose, be that devotional, magical, whatever. So don't think that maybe if you're, when I was living in a dorm room, I had half a bookshelf that was my altar. And it basically was just the place where I stored magical tools. It was not anything fancy. And it worked great. Now, as a more established person with a longer history of practice, I have all the tools, and so I have a great big altar for all of my tools. Devotional stuff at the top, storage stuff down at the bottom. It's great. But it doesn't have to be big, fancy. I have a friend that loved making Altoid altars. You know, you take an Altoid tin and you put all your stuff in there so that when you're traveling, you can just open an Altoid tin and, you know, get some little Lego toys and minifigs and prop them up, and you've got an altar. So it doesn't have to be something that you've seen on Merlin. It can be very, very simple. Working space. Most of what we're going to be talking about in terms of sacred space in this course is going to be working space. It's the space that you clear to do the thing. If I'm going to do a spell, say I'm going to do a healing spell, something to strengthen my immune system because pandemic. What I might do is cast a magical circle, cleanse and tune the space, you know, invite spiritual allies to come and help me do a magical working to raise energy to strengthen my immune system. So to do that, you know, I'm going to clear the space because I do a lot of other things in this room. This is my work from home desk. You know, I don't want to bring my, oh, look, that spreadsheet is on fire energy to my healing spell. Not super compatible. So I'm going to consecrate the space, and then I might also tune it to be a container to contain the energy I'm going to raise that I'm going to then absorb to strengthen my immune system. That's working space. It's just where you're sitting, standing, whatever, to do the thing. In a lot of books, they'll talk, the magic circle is a 9-foot diameter physical space that is a complete perfect sphere for doing your working. And there's all kinds of sacred geometry reasons for that. That is a little complicated for me, to be honest. My sacred space is very rarely a perfect 9-foot diameter circle. Most of the time, because most of the rooms I'm in are not actually sized for a 9-foot diameter circle. That's actually quite large. And a perfect sphere includes what goes up into the ceiling and the attic and then down into the crawl space. I don't necessarily have perfect control over a space that big. So I might bring it in a little bit. Your sacred space is the space you need, cleansed, protected, consecrated, contained, while you do your working. It might be a cube that is, you know, this desk, the area around my chair, underneath my feet, and over my head while I'm sitting down. Maybe that's all I need. Maybe I'm on the bus and I'm doing a quick protection spell because I'm totally freaked out by the person sitting next to me, touching my body. My little magic circle is going to be a bit of an amoeba at that point. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It does not have to be a perfect circle. It's whatever shape it needs to be to do the job. Now, people have all kinds of thoughts and opinions about what shapes and movements and ways of tuning and thinking about things to make the perfect magical container. And that's awesome. I heartily encourage you to explore different options, try different things. You might find that it only really works for you if you do it a particular way, if you have a certain shape, if you have a certain vision in your head of what the energy is doing. That's cool. Find what works for you and do that. That doesn't mean what I'm doing doesn't work for me, but that's okay too. What I do is what works for me. What you do should be whatever works for you, regardless of what other people say about it. When you're creating working space, you also have to think about how opaque a barrier do you need. And we'll talk about this a little bit when we get into shielding in a few lessons. But a magic circle can be a very thin, kind of soap bubble kind of barrier. It can also be a bank vault. Totally depends on how you do it. I've done circles where, you know, it's one simple kind of ethereal barrier of light around people doing a working. There's, you know, a joyous community raising of energy to promote harmony. it's kind of fine if it's a thin barrier, because it doesn't really matter if something is attracted to that. It's all super positive. If you can't, some of it leaks out. It's all super positive. It's kind of fine. You need someone, it needs to be contained enough that you can then direct it. But it's not super critical that everything is perfectly quarantined. Then sometimes you're doing a super strong protection, cleansing, banishing, defensive ritual, and you need a bank vault. You need just enough grounding so that negative energies can be cleansed and drained, but you do not want anything else crossing those barriers. And so when I do things like that, I'll actually cast multiple circles to create a stronger barrier. Which of course means in reverse, when it's time to take it down, you have to dispel multiple barriers. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so just a thing to think about. When you are creating sacred space, you want it tuned to your intention and your purpose. The point of sacred space is to help you do whatever it is you're doing. If you're freaking out about doing sacred space correctly, that's not helping you accomplish your goals, and maybe you need to look at a different approach. Yeah. So actual creation of sacred space. The most common is the magic circle. And depending if you're a visual person, a physical person, I've seen people cast circles in a number of different ways. I'm very visual physical. I like to physically move about the space, and I use my fingers like a wand to just draw a line and envision kind of almost like paint spreading across the room and then over the ceiling and under the floor to make a fully contained shape, whatever that looks like. Sometimes it's a sphere, sometimes it's a cube, sometimes it's weird amorphous amoeba. It's all good. You can also do it by, pure visualization. When I was in undergrad, I once had a roommate that was a little bit freaked out by all the things, which, fair, it's kind of weird. So I would literally do magical ritual laying in my bed pretending to take a nap. Everything was visualization in my head because I had to look like I was taking a nap. It's just as effective. But it's nice to be able to physically move about and have some kind of kinesthetic awareness of what you're doing energetically, just because it's easier to think about. Abstract is hard and concrete is easier for the human brain to process. That's just how that is. A lot of people will cast a circle using a wand or an athame. An athame is basically just a magical dagger. I actually have a sword that I use for certain types of rituals. You can go around with a rattle, you can go around with feathers, you can go around with smoke, you can go around with incense, you can go around asperging with water. I know a person who actually he was super, super concrete and physical, and energetic visualization was not his jam. So he actually bought a really cheap tarp at Home Depot and painted a circle. I think it was like a 6-foot diameter circle on this drop cloth tarp thing. And he would roll it out when it was time to do magic, stand inside the physical painted circle, do his thing, dispel the circle, and then roll up this big tarp and put it in the closet. It worked out really well for him. So things can be very physical, or they can be very ephemeral. In some traditions, you will actually sprinkle powder around the edge of the circle, and to open the circle, you physically take your foot and move aside some of the powder to create an opening. There's a bunch of movies where, to get away from the demons, you have to have the circle of salt, like Hocus Pocus. And then you have to break the line of the salt, and the demons can get through. But you could actually do something kind of similar with a magic circle. Another way of doing it would be using eggshell powder or red brick dust to create your circle. And that's a very powerful protective energetic barrier for certain types of workings. You don't have to get that fancy about it. It's really all about what works for your brain in terms of thinking of being inside an energetic container. Do you need it to be physical? Is it cool if it's super ephemeral? You know, I've seen people that will cast circles by clapping, literally, creating a sound kind of barrier. It's pretty cool. You can do all kinds of things. I was once at a ritual where the circle was evoked via flute. It was really cool. I have no ability to play musical instruments. Not for me. But it was awesome that somebody else was able to do it. So yeah, things can be very energetic, very ephemeral, very physical, very concrete. It really depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. One thing I would caution you with, things like salt and sometimes water can potentially stain or damage certain materials. So if you're like indoors on carpet, maybe go with baking soda. They can be vacuumed up real easily. It's not going to hurt either the carpet or your vacuum cleaner. If you're outside where things are growing, maybe go with like Epsom salt rather than, you know, table salt, because the phrase salting the earth is a thing. Table salt is not good for plants. Magnesium salts are part of fertilizer and are good for plants, and so you're absolutely safe to do that outdoors most places. Obviously check your own environment. If you live in some, you know, if you live in the desert, if you live in places where there's endangered species, you know, take prudent caution and make sure you're not going to poison the earth, because that's not good on any level. Dispelling sacred space. I will never forget, I once went to a ritual where they spent 20 minutes casting sacred space, cleansing, consecrating, chanting, invoking, and then at the end of the ritual, they literally took a sword and popped it like a bubble, and it felt so bad. It was like energetic shrapnel, like shot around the room and slid down the walls, and everyone like freaked out a little bit. It was terrible. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Any efforts you spend casting a circle, you have to spend the same amount of effort to dispel the circle. By which I mean, you know, if you're going to envision kind of that soap bubble kind of wall of energy going all the way around you, when it's time to dispel it, you have to envision all of that soap bubble energy receding back to where it came from, going down and then grounding out that excess energy. Anything you do to bring energy into the space, you have to do to bring the energy out of the space. If you are lucky enough to have permanent sacred space, you can kind of shortcut that process. I do most of my magic in this room. I also work in this room. But that means that when it's time to dispel my magic circle, I can literally just push that energy into the walls and kind of let it hang out as kind of a semi-permanent barrier to kind of make this a pleasant space. But I own the building, I own the land, this is my space, I can do things like that. Back when I went into an office every day, and will again relatively soon, I can't do that. I can't enchant my cube permanently because it's not mine. You know, even if I work there for 10 years, it's not mine. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of magical jurisdiction later when we start talking about spell work and intentions and ethics and all the nitty-gritty bits. But really, it's just a matter of treat your space with respect, and then your space will respect you. We are energetically connected to the space where we do our magic. Most of the times we're pulling energy out of our environments to fuel spell work. That means you need to be on good terms with that energy. And part of that is being mindful of how you create and dispel sacred space. So down in the description, I've got a link to a website that actually has a really great kind of easy description of how to cast a magic circle by Tess Whitehurst. I highly recommend you check that out if you have any questions about kind of what magic circles kind of look like and what they are. If you're very interested in the topic, there is a book called Casting Sacred Space by Ivo Dominguez Jr. He's a fantastic practitioner I really respect. Talks all about the different ways you can cast sacred space, why you would do it, different traditions, ways of doing it, different spiritualities. It's really, really great book. I highly recommend it. Like I said, got that down in the description. Please, if you decide to buy it, get it from your local independent bookstore. That brings us to divination. Divination is a source of many, many misconceptions, not least about the Ouija board. But there's many, many methods of divination. Which of course begs the question, what is divination? Divination is seeking insight into a situation via metaphysical means. It's things like tarot, talking boards, runes, I Ching, scrying. There's a zillion ways of doing it, throwing the bones. Divination is not fortune telling. There are some very important differences there. Divination is tapping into the energy of a situation via some kind of intermediary tool like tarot cards and trying to get insight into that situation. It might be communicating with spirits who have access to information we don't via some kind of tool like a scrying mirror or a talking board. It's ways of getting insight we just don't have access to via normal means. The limitations of that. Divination is really good for giving you information about energies that currently exist. So if I want to know what energies I can bring to my workplace to help me advance my career. My workplace exists. The energies of my workplace exist. My energies interact with them all the time, because it's what I do. So there's a lot that a divination tool can get into and read and help me get information about. Divination is not good for, when will I meet my future spouse? That's fortune telling. See, depending on who you are and who your future spouse, if they exist, are, those energies might not exist yet. Those connections might not have been formed yet. You can ask like a deity to answer questions like that, and they usually won't. But you can ask. But it's the kind of thing that is just, it's not the strength of divination. Divination is much, much better at reading current situations. It is good at things like XYZ thing happened in the past. What can I do now to try and make sure that doesn't happen again? All those past energies exist. Your energy exists. The tools can tap into that and help you figure out how to avoid repetition of a pattern. That's a good thing you can ask for divination. Be reasonable. Divination is not the end-all be-all, and it is not something that you're going to get instant magic success by following the advice of the tarot cards. Tarot cards are super ambiguous. That's kind of the point. It's really, really good. Like I said, if you have a number of options for what you might do in a given situation, it can help you get some insight into what are the likely outcomes if you choose each of those options, so you can make a better informed decision. it's going back to that magic versus magical thinking thing. Insight and magic, not magical thinking, not ultimate panacea, not going to tell you the secrets of the universe for free. That's not how it works. Yeah, there's also a million resources out and about in the world about using divination tools. All the different divination tools. Pick one. Try it out. See how it works for you. There's no kind of the many, many books that are out there on things like tarot and runes and scrying, I've yet to find any particular book that really is just like nails it. At least not the way I do divination. I tend to do divination very intuitively, where I might look at a definition in the book and say, this says that this card, Three of Swords is very traditionally the, a broken heart and outside intervention in a situation in a negative manner, whatever. I will look at that as a polite suggestion, and then I will look at the card and see what pops out for me and intuit what's important in any given reading. That's one way of thousands of doing it. I highly recommend go watch some of the, 5 million YouTube videos on tarot. Read one of the, 3 million books in English, or whatever your native language may be. Explore your options, try things out. I can only give you so much information without this being 9 hours long. It's already long enough. So once you've picked a divination tool that you like, be it tarot, runes, bones, whatever, you have to periodically cleanse and reconsecrate your tools. So when you buy a tarot deck, most of the time it's been sitting on a store shelf or in the back of a warehouse, a big pile, and you don't really know what kind of energies have been interacting and permeating into that physical divination tool, whatever it is. So you've got to cleanse it and make sure any negative energy is just cleansed away. I usually do a very, very simple, like I light a candle and light some incense and just wave the tool over the flames, let it burn everything else off, wave the tool through the incense, let it consecrate to my purposes, and then I'll hold it in my hand and say, you are now my tool. I'm going to use you in this manner. If you have any problems with that, energetically ping me, and I'll see what I can do. Some tools like certain types of questions and will be really productive when you ask them certain types of questions. Other types of tools will just only talk about certain things. I have one deck that only accurately answers questions about work. I don't know why, but it is my professional deck talking about my career. I have another tool that I only talk about spiritual stuff that is personal. I can't use it for anybody other than me. I have some tools I only use on Samhain. I have some tools I only use on Walpurgisnacht. Things like that. There's all kinds of different personalities and quirks you're going to find in different divination tools. Different tools are better at different types of questions. A pendulum is a great yes-no. Here's my option. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, okay. It's not great at uncovering underlying energetic situations, currents, and things. It's not that subtle a tool. Try out different tools. See how they work for you. When you're actually doing a reading with a divination tool, regardless of what it is, as a beginner, it's good to take the time to formally ground and center before you try to do a reading. And that's because we have a lot of energy of our own to bring to a situation. We have a lot of thoughts and opinions, and we're trying to get insight from the tool. We're not trying to spit out what we've already got in our head. So take a few minutes to ground and center yourself so that when you approach the divination tool, it's with a clean slate, so that the tool can do the work rather than just reading you. Particularly if you're doing a reading for somebody else, because then your energy is not that helpful. On that point, there's such a thing called a conflict of interest. We are not always great at doing divination for people we care very much about. I've done many, many readings for very close friends, and there's definitely situations where I care too much about the outcome of a situation to do divination for somebody. You know, if I have too much of a vested interest in what choice somebody makes, I just don't trust myself to be totally unbiased. I'm a human. I'm not that great. You know, if I super duper care, I can do the, okay, here is the reading and my interpretation of it. It's coming largely from me rather than the cards. Take that with the grain of salt you will, dear friend of mine. You know, if sometimes also cards will tell you to go fuck yourself. You will ask them a question and they will just refuse to answer. Or, and this happens a lot, if you ask the same question over and over and over again, hoping to get a different answer, your divination tool might get bitchy. And you'll start getting really harsh readings. Sometimes I will use the Thoth deck, the Aleister Crowley, and no, I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry. I've heard it Thoth, Thoth. I don't really know. It's T-H-O-T. That tarot, the Aleister Crowley version, when I use that, it's super duper blunt. Like, it will tell you the harshest possible message that is still mainly accurate, as opposed to something like the Rider-Waite deck, which is the Rider-Waite deck is used by a lot of people across a lot of spectrums of experience and expertise, and so it tends to be a little bit more gentle, particularly if you're a beginner. Different tools have different personalities. One of the best things you can do to make sure you actually get useful information out of a divination tool is to ask the right question. You know, you can ask questions like, am I going to do X, Y, and Z by next Thursday? That's a yes-no question. Ask a pendulum. And if all you need is a yes-no, cool. A better question might be is, hey, I need this to happen by Thursday. What can I do? What kinds of things can I do to make sure that happens? I have this situation happening. What do I need to think about to make sure I make the right choice? Slightly more open-ended, exploratory types of questions. You know, the point of divination is to get insight you do not already have. It's not just to confirm what you already think. Now, I do have a little, like, yes-no coin that I will use to confirm if am I correct in my thinking about this? Yes, no. It all depends on what you're trying to do. The other thing to think about is divination is ephemeral. Energy changes. Divination tools read energies that exist, unless you're doing certain spirit work where they have access to things we just don't. But most of the time, your divination tool is reading energies that currently exist. Things can change radically over time. A tarot reading about your future from January 1st, 2020 and April 1st, 2020 might have looked radically different because the world looked radically different. You know, your divination tools do not necessarily know everything that is coming. So you can ask questions of divination tools like, what do I need to do for the next year? what does my future, going to do? But you're really only going to get actionable responses no more than like 6 weeks out. Stick with a month. Energy changes. Ask about what you need to do right now. Ask about what you think about right now. Ask, from where we are now, what can I start planning for? Don't ask, what's going to happen in 5 years? Those energies just don't exist yet, for the most part. But it's not going to give you reliable, actionable, useful answers. Other ways of doing divination are things like dream interpretation and augury. So, what is augury? Augury is reading omens and signs. The old, think of like Groundhog's Day with the groundhog sees its shadow. That's actually a form of augury. I think like dream interpretation, dreams are weird. And there's a lot of books out there on dream interpretation and psychology and different ways of thinking about what dreams really are. And honestly, I don't do a lot of work with dreams. It's not a specialty I have. I will sometimes have dreams where I know it's more than just brain processing bubble. There's more to it than that. And when I do get a dream where I think it might be more than meets the eye, I'll do a divination. Like, hey, I had this dream. Did it mean something more? Help me figure it out. And the divination will help me figure out whether or not it was just my burrito or if it was, some kind of mystical sign. Augury, things that I do use in terms of like auguries, like if you are on your way to a job interview and you nearly get in a car accident, that might be a warning about the job you're about to interview for. If you get swooped by a bald eagle eating a rabbit, that might mean you need to pay attention to certain nature signs. Yes, that happened to me. It was really creepy. If a coyote crosses your path in the middle of the city, that's not super normal. Might mean something. Things that happen that are synchronicities. There's definitely a Spotify augury, augury by iPod. If the same songs come up in shuffle mode in your playlist, that can sometimes be a form of augury. Basically anything where something happens to you and you think it has more to tell you than what meets the eye. If you see some person on the bus and they remind you of something that has happened, or some other person that you knew, maybe it means that you need to check on that person. Maybe you need to think about some unresolved situation that happened with them in the past. There's all kinds of books and lessons and videos and things you can find about augury and dream interpretation. I invite you to go and do more research if that's something you're interested in. Not my area of expertise. The more advanced divination are things like spirit communication and necromancy. These are things I do and can tell you quite a bit about. We'll talk more about spirit communication when we get into metaphysical entities, but the important part at this stage is if you're doing divination involving spirits, be they ancestors, be they metaphysical entities, be they deities, they have access to information that we don't, because they exist on a different vibrational plane, like we talked about in a previous lesson. That's where you can get some of that nitty-gritty, detailed, movie and television level divination information. And this is where we talk about things like talking boards. Talking board is the generic term for a Ouija board, if you're not familiar with it. It's a board with a planchette and a spirit of whatever flavor can speak to you. There is nothing evil about talking boards. They are often used incorrectly, and that can cause problems for people. If you're actually going to try to engage in spirit communication, there are many, many resources. I'll put a couple down in the description. But you have to know who you're talking to. And you have to have boundaries. The same way you don't go on a blind date without any kind of backup plan. You tell your friends, oh, I'm meeting this person at this time in this location. I expect to be back by this time. I will send a signal, either this if I am fine and you don't have to worry about it, or this other thing if I need an intervention. You have to do the same kind of thing when you're dealing with spirits. Hey, any positive, helpful entity that wants to help me with this particular situation for this specific time frame is invited to speak to me via this tool while I am actively in this circle. At the time that I am finished, I will say so, and then you must depart, and you may not return without explicit invitation. That's the bit all the movies mess up. The reason things go bad in the movies is you think, hey, does anybody want to talk to me? Ooh, open a portal into my bedroom. I'm sure this won't cause a problem. Yeah, doesn't generally go well. So, like I said, we'll talk more about spirit communication when we get into metaphysical entities in lesson 9. But the important thing to think about at this point is if that is something you think you may want to pursue later, start thinking about what type of information would you get via spirit communication. What information would be better obtained from other sources? It's really all up to you. One thing that I do really recommend, if you want to learn divination and you want to get good at it, you have to practice. You have to practice over and over and over again. There are a million tarot study groups and rune study groups where you can do readings for each other as practice. There's Facebook groups, there's Reddit channels, there's all kinds of resources for doing readings for people to practice. Do so. Find a friend that's willing to, get readings from you. Find strangers on the internet. Don't give them your home address. Practice. Practice, 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 practice. And I know some people that absolutely subscribe to the method of journaling all of the readings you do to help you think about how you're interpreting various things in your divination. Oh, I get this rune and it always means these kinds of things. Oh, I do get this tarot card for this person. For them, it always means this other thing, despite, kind of what the book might say. I have mixed feelings about that because when I do divination, I'm almost channeling information and I don't have perfect recall of what I say when I'm doing divination. If I'm doing divination for myself, then I will write it out because literally writing it out will be the channeling bit where I'm getting the information from outside sources. Only experimentation will tell you whether it works for you. But it's a thing to think about. Might work for you, might not work for you. So yeah. From this, some exercises you can try to help improve your skills and your practice. Think about different ways of creating sacred space. Permanent, temporary, altars, circles. Think about different ways that sacred space exists that you interact with in your life. Are there, certain places that are basically sacrosanct in your life through tradition. You know, my husband's family goes to Priest Lake, Idaho every year, and it's like church for them. It's crazy. It is a very special, sacred place to them. I don't feel that way. I feel that way about Mount Rainier. But think about those places for you. What do they mean to you? How would you consider doing magic in those spaces? Take some time and actually research where you live and where you work, where you spend your time. Find out the history of the land. Are there very positive things that have happened? Are there negative things that have happened? Are there places around you that maybe need some healing work done? Are there trash cleanups that need to be done? It can be very mundane. Think about that kind of stuff and try to improve your relationship with your territory. It can be something as simple as walking around your neighborhood, giving your respect to the landscape. It can be all the way up to volunteering to do park cleanup or, beach cleanup or that kind of thing. Or maybe taking a little extra time to thank the trees in your yard for bringing you shade and beauty. It doesn't have to be big, major things. Just try to learn more about your space and give it a little love. Give it a little TLC, because then it will help take care of you. Actually create sacred space. Whether that's casting a magical circle or making an altar, give it a try. How does it feel to you? When you're in sacred space, does it feel different than when you're out of sacred space? Something that's super common is if you cast a circle, you won't notice while you're in it, but when it comes time to dispel it, suddenly, it will get 4 or 5 degrees colder because you've been containing energy that then gets released. It's a great sign that you've successfully created sacred space, though it's not necessarily something that happens. I've been in ritual where during the course of ritual in the sacred space, the air is still and calm and warm, and then you open the sacred space and wind rushes through. That's kind of cool. Very validating. But give it a try. See how it feels for you. Then pick a divination method and try it out. How does it work for you? Does it not work for you? There are certain tools that just don't jam with certain people. I personally can't use runes. Doesn't work for me at all. I also don't have a great relationship with the Norse pantheon, which might have something to do with it. There are certain tools that will work for you and certain tools that just won't be great. I very rarely use a pendulum. It's just not my tool. I tend to stick to cartomancy of various kinds, tarot and oracles and loremans and things like that. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what works for you. So, yeah, that is sacred space and divination. Our next lesson, we're going to start looking at correspondence and magical components. Hope to see you then. Bye.